Friends, in this discussion we'll be engaging with the idea of literature and life in their interaction, and we'll see how in the 20th century and in the 21st century life is posing peculiar problems to the writer, and the writer is contending with the pressures in a way in which he or she did not do so in the previous centuries. And to begin the discussion with Professor Payal Nagpal, I would just make this short point about the 20th century writing, that somehow after the great writing of the 19th century subsided, and after it had already very sufficiently and very clearly emphasized the presence of society, the 20th century seems to have gone weak on the aspect of what we call life. In fact, there is a book, and Professor Payal Nagpal would have definitely read it, and that book is by Arnold Kettle, in which he talks about the category of life in literature. And he says that there is a literature that teaches or that shows some kind of a pattern, and there is that literature which bubbles with energy, which is full of energy. So there are some writers who do not let their opinion be known to the reader, and who simply talk about the felicities of life, the pleasures of life. And there are others who always have a picture in front of them, and they want to fill it up with the colors as if they were picking up colors from life, and you can't tell what idea they gave. So this concept of life and pattern and he was talking about the English novel at that point of time. So Pilgrim's Progress, for instance, would be the example of pattern, because he's educating the masses, and Dickens's example would be that of pleasure, would be that of life. So when we talk about life, do we also mean the felicities, the enthusiasm, the celebration, the pleasure, and do we keep the ideas off? And if not off, at least we will keep them at a safe distance. So these problems occur in the 20th century, and we will become conscious about this. So how do you respond to this question of the complex relationship between life and literature in the 20th century?
In fact, that this is the second part exactly of my discussion. The idea being that when we move from an understanding of the 19th century understanding of the relationship between literature and life, from there when we move on to movements like, for instance, art for art's sake and so on, and by the time one reaches the 20th century, it's there is a kind of internalization that takes place which prevents an understanding of life, and an objective here is not very simplistic but very complex, I would say. A closer understanding of life is prevented then in the 20th century. It's the focus is shifted more. The society is no longer the coordinate in that sense. It's more the individual. And here I'd just like to share a few pointers. So from the understanding, and I'm quoting Ralph Fox here, that the novel is not merely fictional prose, it is the prose of man's life, the first art to attempt to take the whole man and give him expression. So and Fox says that the novelist has a very special responsibility, and he of course talks about history in the sense that the novelist has to respond to the present and the past of his country. So, and what he inherits from the past is important because it shows a kind of cultural heritage. So Fox also in a sense kind of privileges the novel because of the kind of secret life that it reveals in a sense of individuals. So this idea of the novel dealing with the individual, and he calls it the epic of the struggle of the individual against society, against nature. I would transform the word against and would change it to explain the connections, the different relations, the fors, against, everything of the relationship, a deeper complex understanding of the relationship of the individual with nature and society. This brings us to we move on from this understanding to for instance the whole idea of art for art's sake, where Gautier and the others, people like Victor Cousin, and then we have Walter Pater, who presented art for its own sake, and of course they foregrounded the beauty of art. There's an entire movement of aesthetics that begins with this understanding of art for its own sake. And however, it also, for instance, the phrase connotes the idea that a work of art has an intrinsic value without didactic or moral purpose. Now, we must raise the question that when we look at work prior to this, it's not as if the writers of the early 19th century present a kind of didactic or moral purpose, but they give us a view to the society, and at the same time a kind of intrinsic value to the work emerges. But when we move into art for art's sake, the idea is writing for its own, has its intrinsic value, writing for its own sake, and this is of course primarily seen in art, but one can also see it in poetry, for instance. So with this, the understanding of literature, the boundaries are changing, and this shift to an intrinsic value becomes more pronounced in the 20th century. And the question that you asked about literature in the 20th century kind of brings us to the point where this internalization in a sense is complete, and the value is more intrinsic than anything else, and looked at from the point of view of the writer and the work of writing that is produced by the writer. So what would you say about, for instance, this shift in a sense to art for art's sake?
Well, definitely art is a very complex issue in itself, and in the 20th century people became aware of the form of the art, the way art is developed in the hands of the author, and then presented to the reader in a different sense in which the question was understood earlier. So I would say that this is an important thing, that art is recognized as an important component of life, and that without art life would be just very a small part of what we call life in general. Since you are a drama critic and a drama scholar, so in fact I would ask this question from you. I'm curious to know as to what kind of life would appeal to a dramatist like Bertolt Brecht. Can you say something about that?
So I think Bertolt Brecht actually changes this, because in the 20th century, the writers that we are, I'm referring to here, are the modernist writers. But Brecht presents to us an example of the way in which modernism can actually be used to understand life. And that's not probably something that is being done by the other writers, but Brecht does it, and it's in a sense using the realist style, but transforming it, because one is no longer in the 19th century, one is in the 20th century, and the First World War has already taken place, and a lot of his very important plays are written just at the outbreak of the Second World War. So I think he's clearly stating how life needs to be expressed and understood, and he uses the parable form for that reason. And he's and the moment we use the word parable, what we are in effect saying is that we are understanding life through another structure. We are understanding the problems of life through another structure, and he presents within drama, he presents the story, he presents the form of the parable, so that the problems in a sense in life can be understood, and no answers are to be provided, but it's the social reality that he's addressing. And this, if I were to go back to the problem of the raised in the early 20th century in that sense, and Christopher Codwell talks about art having a social function, and moving from this position, he looks at two very important aspects when we look at the relationship between literature and life. And one is how with the establishment of the industry itself that produces books in a sense, will that determine what or who a writer is and what she or he is writing? And the second is that the other extreme of looking at art for its own sake, and then as a result making it more formless and personal and individualistic. And for Caldwell, of course, this culminates, the second aspect culminates in a lot of movements at the turn of the century. And however, Caldwell brings in what he calls the role of the affect. Today, I think the affect theory is a separate, branch of literary studies and literary theory. But Caldwell talks about the affect of, the relationship that is there, for instance, between the mimetic realism, which is an aspect of real life that is being presented, and the response that it produces in the audience. So I think this, in a sense, completes the coordinates that we want to establish, in a sense, in our discussion of literature and life, which is the role of the writer, the work that is produced by the writer, and of course the reception of that work by a certain audience. And so he says, this, in a sense, I think prepares for us the kind of map that we, really speaking, need to look at. What would you say about the impact? And you have worked intensively on both Ralph Fox and Christopher Caldwell. So what would you say about this idea of the impact of literature on the minds of the reader, on the audience, as it were?
No, both these critics are 20th century critics, and they are both committed, and they died young, and they died, not in England, they died in the Spanish War, and at a young age of 35 or so, and till the last moment of their life, they were writing, they were understanding, they were reading things, and they were really very cognizant of what was happening around them. So taking that kind of a height, achieving that kind of a height in the understanding of things is rare in the 20th century, and these two are perhaps the best examples of the working of thought and the working against society that is ridden with different contradictions. So I think they have a lot of insight to give into the question of the individual, the question of the epic fight that is going on, and things associated with it. Mm-hmm. And in that context, I also brought in, because these are the two critics, so I thought there should be a drama critic and like Bertolt Brecht. And since you have not merely read and interpreted Brecht, but also acted on the stage, so tell us about one or two plays of his where the parable is used, and parable is used in order to understand the depth, the intensity of life around the parable. So can you say something about Good Woman of Széchenyi?
I think if we look at the parable play, The Good Woman of Széchenyi, The Good Person of Széchenyi, the two different translations. So the questions that Brecht is raising are totally, life-enduring questions, in a sense, and he's asking that in a world that is so skewed, where relationships are so unequal, the social relations are structured in a way that they are so unequal, what does goodness mean, first of all? And how is it possible for a woman to be good? And the element of goodness that he locates is in a woman who's probably is the most marginalized of the women in the society, and she's practically outside of the margins of the society. So Shente, in that sense, is somebody, if at all there is any element of goodness, it's located in Shente. There is probably nobody else who they can think of as being the good person. So it's important that the good person here is a woman.
The good person is a woman. The good person is a person who is marginalized, and who is able to tell you that she is free from the complexes of the supposedly elitist society, and she can cast a glance at these people critically. That's what Brecht is showing. So his good woman is not good in the sense in which people conventionally think. And the other writer that you have worked on is Jean Genet. So tell something about his view of life in the middle part of the 20th century.
So Genet's view of life is extremely complex, because Genet is, is totally outside the entire structure of whatever constitutes society. And he was he led a life that I mean, he was also in prison for a while, and Jean Cocteau and the others, they managed to actually get him out. But Jean Genet, again, he describes to the readers in his novels, in his plays, the absolutely seamy side of life. And the life in which people who are, it's one thing to say that people who are in the who live on the margins and who are let's say economically displaced, but he's talking about people, for instance, he's talking about the lives of thieves and criminals and people who are outside, the people who frequent the brothels. He's talking about life totally outside the purview of the society, and he's positioning himself there as a writer, and he's positioning all his characters there. And it is from that perspective that he looks at the society that we understand, in a sense, mainstream society.
There is a story of balcony. They just like that, informally, so that there is an example made of the comment that he makes about Society of France.
So, in The Balcony, again, a play of the late 50s, he's basically presenting to us the characters of the bishop, the judge, the general, and these are people who in their real life are not the bishop, judge or the general. They are people from very, very ordinary circumstances, but they frequent the brothel, and the brothel is not to be called the brothel, but it's called the House of Illusions, and Madame Irma, who runs it, allows these customers to actually play out their dream roles, and so they desire to be playing the role of the bishop, the judge and the general. And he completely reverses it, and he shows how there is a kind of dialectic at work in society, and how ultimately when the judge remains the judge because there is a thief in the society. And so Genet draws attention to the fact how the system in the society itself, the way things are structured, they facilitate and create the presence of the need to steal, the need to be the thief, so that the judges are going to be there. At the same time, the second part of the play also, I mean, something that is going to be so very relevant in today's time, which is the use of the photographers, how an image can be created, how an image can be produced. And so there is no real bishop and there is no real judge, because there's a revolution raging outside, and these people are kind of playing out their fantasies in Irma's House of Illusions. So how the photographer can just give the robes of the bishop to anybody and click photographs and circulate them and present this person as the bishop. So I think it's a very, very, I must say, he was extremely perceptive and was able to understand how technology, in a sense, was changing. I mean, the very House of Illusions is, in my own work, I've compared it with the structure of the panopticon. So, how Irma she's got, these cameras fitted in everywhere, and she can see everything. So it's a very, very complex machinery that he presents to us in the play, and even in the other play. So it's this understanding of life, and is presented in a way in which we can understand people on the margins, which is where, again, to go back to the 20th century idea, I think we also need to understand that when we talk about the connections between literature and life, literature foregrounds the cause of, or presents, gives space to people who are on the margins. And if this were not the case, then women writers, in a sense, would really be a neglected lot. And the fact, that Virginia Woolf at one point says that, writing was something that women took to, because, it didn't take much. There weren't very many material obstacles in their way, and which is why the writing of novels particularly allowed women to express themselves. So I think when we look at the connections between literature and life, we also need to understand that literature helps us focus on those otherwise kind of hidden spaces that are there. And that, of course, today we even talk about women writers and poets and novelists in time periods where in a teaching of literature they had been ignored for the longest time. So I think that we also need to look at this potential in literature to concentrate on the varied aspects of life. And since you had mentioned Arnold Kettle, I'd like to bring in Arnold Kettle, who says that a novel is a living thing, all one and continuous like any other organism, and in proportion as it lives will it be found. And he says that in each of the parts there is something of the other parts. So I think the biggest connection that we can see here is that in the writing of the novel, for instance, the parts here are also the parts of life that are reflected within the structure of the novel, for instance. But at a larger level, we need to extend this understanding to that of literature at large. What would you say about the connection, for instance, between literature and entities that are on the margins?
You have beautifully brought out the character of illusion in the 20th century. It was an illusion per se in the 19th century, but in the 20th century it's being put to great artistic use. And in fact, through illusion, you can understand the reality better. In fact, the word was initially used for criticism. It was there earlier also in the Romantic movement in the 19th century, but critically this word was used extensively by Arnold Kettle, whom you quoted, and the book is called Illusion and Reality. So he's talking about this, and then see the way you came to illusory in the context of Jean Genet, where he's just showing that people play roles, and what makes them is their dress, is the duty that is given to them.
Yes.
And when they have played that role, then they come back to finally the margins to which they might belong, and this way life goes on in circles. And the 20th century that way is a very slippery century. It's a century that disturbs us, that destabilizes us, and puts us on a kind of fulcrum where we just do not know where we stand. And that is captured so well by people like Jean Genet and Bertolt Brecht, who in this kind of instability are able to bring in drama, representation, and talk about the margins. So finally, you might say something about the role of women writers in the 20th century, which was not the case earlier. Of course, in the 19th century, we have a large number of women writers in England, but in the colonies and all, women were not in the forefront. So say something about this, and please conclude.
Yes. So the reason I quoted Virginia Woolf was precisely this, because I think that it is this potential today. For instance, if we study the Romantic movement, we study literature written during the Romantic period, it would be incomplete without looking at the women who have written at that time. So I think this potential in literature itself to kind of concentrate on the entities living on the margins is one aspect, but at the same time, people who are living on the margins, for them to appropriate literature, to make it their own, and to find creative expression that reflects their understanding of society is a very, very important aspect. So I think it's this the relationship between literature and life is something that of course belongs to all the genres, but when we understand the phrase literature and life, we need to understand it in all its complexity, in its entirety, in a certain kind of organic totality, which brings into consideration the different aspects and different perspectives that are there in society. Just looking at literature and life from any one perspective would always be incomplete. We always need to foreground the perspectives that have not been looked at so far. And the connection between literature and life brings in history, ideology, resistant aspects, everything. It needs to be looked at from this point of view.
I think this is a very fine conclusion, and viewers, you have already heard different points being made by Professor Payal Nagpal regarding the interaction between and the connection between literature and life, and you've seen that in this part of the discussion we came to the 20th century, where a different scene emerged in the discussion. The scene containing the individuals, scene containing the instabilities of life, the focus upon the margins, focus upon the people who live on the margins, and women. And it is this kind of emergence of these perspectives that has enriched the understanding of life in literature in the 20th and the 21st century. So with these remarks, we come to the end of this and close the discussion. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.